I wanted to introduce everyone to Lyle Prowse. I didn't really know how to address Lyle. I know whenever I'm speaking to a pilot, it's always Captain Prowse or Captain Jones, but Lyle just said, call me Lyle. So Lyle, with that, we're very interested in hearing your story. And I think now more than ever, with the pandemic and the isolation and the stress that's being brought down on people, your story of redemption and hope is kind of just what the doctor ordered. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, and we're all looking forward to hearing your story.
Thank you, Mario, and thank you, Brandon, for all the work you do on this. And thank you for having me to be part of this recovery program that you've got here. I'm always willing to participate in these things. I start off by saying my name is Lyle, and I'm an alcoholic, and I've said that for a long time now. I still remember the very first time I tried to get those words out of my mouth when I was in treatment, and they just wouldn't come up. And it took me 3 times to get those words out because of the stigma and the shame and everything that's attached to the idea and the word and the label of being an alcoholic. I've said that phrase probably 10,000 times by now. I don't walk around with a sign around my neck, but I understand the difference now between being a practicing alcoholic, where the shame and the stigma really lies, and being a recovering alcoholic. And I understand the difficulty for newcomers to deal with these terms like alcoholic and addict, and the idea that that somehow, some way, they've developed this disease. As a matter of fact, when I went into treatment, I'm not so sure I even believed it was a disease. And if I did, I thought maybe it had occurred at some AMA convention where all the doctors had a show of hands and somehow or other voted it in. I didn't really believe it was a bona fide legitimate disease until I got into treatment. And then I learned what it takes for a disease to actually be a disease. And that this was declared a disease in 1956, but only after hundreds of studies involving indisputable medical science and brain studies and all of these things. And I didn't know that every disease known to man, whether it's smallpox, malaria, whatever it is, any disease, has to be declared a disease by the most skeptical group of people in the entire United States, and that is medical scientists. That they won't even believe it's going to get dark at night if you can't legitimately prove through some kind of factual data that the sun will go down. So I learned that before anything can be a disease, we have to know what causes it, and sometimes that's the last thing that ever happens. And even today, there are lingering questions about that. But there have to be symptoms that involve this, that identify this as a disease, where given only those symptoms, it can only be one particular thing, and it would be identified by the symptoms. And they have to know whether or not there's a course, a predictable course, and an outcome. And so alcoholism has fulfilled all of those requirements and did so many, many years ago, and yet still people look at it like it's a bad habit or it's formed as a result of bad character. We just need some willpower on it, just say no and all that stuff, none of which is true or accurate. I've never seen a topic about which there's so much more a myth and misinformation than the subject of alcoholism. And I can throw addiction in there too. They're typically one and the same. I'm an alcoholic. I've never done any drugs. I didn't even smoke cigarettes. But people do drugs for the same reason that I like alcohol. We like the effect. The difference is the substance and the delivery system and some of the brain chemistry that deals with different things in different ways. But essentially, it's the disease is one and the same. I've never known anybody that wanted to be an alcoholic or an addict. Never. I never knew anybody that picked up their first drink, certainly not me. I said, I think I'll drink until my liver explodes or until I can find a way to destroy my life through this by becoming an alcoholic. I've never known anybody who started smoking cigarettes who lit up the first cigarette and said, I think I'll do this until I develop lung cancer or any of the other forms of cancer. So I don't hold people responsible for being an alcoholic or an addict unless that was their intention. when they began. And I've yet to meet the first person. I met thousands and thousands of alcoholics along the way. But I do hold people responsible for, however, is their recovery. Once they know, once it has been shown and proven that they're alcoholic or an addict, they are responsible at that point in time. They become responsible for their own recovery. Now, I certainly am. My whole view of all of this has changed immensely since March the 8th of 1990, when I became the first airline pilot in American aviation commercial history to be arrested for flying a commercial airliner under the influence of alcohol, which led immediately to an arrest, a trial, a conviction, and a sentence, and being sent to federal prison as a result of that. No pilot before that had ever had that occur to him. I find it interesting nowadays when a pilot's name shows up on TV or in the paper, having gone through TSA and he smells like alcohol, they pull him out of the line. There's a brief mention and it's gone. I can tell you that as the first pilot that this ever occurred to or happened to or was brought before the public's attention, I was absolutely stormed with a media blitzkrieg that went on and on. It was relentless, endless, and nonstop, and it went on and on and on. And I mean, I was the lead story every news segment for weeks into months, all over the nation and locally. I did not know that was going to happen. And I didn't think the coverage was ever going to stop. And then, of course, came the aftermath of all of the tabloids that picked up on it and portrayed me as the most worthless human being on the face of the planet. Late night comics got into it. And I'm in a treatment center. I'm dying 1,000 deaths. I'm absolutely blown apart, shattered, devastated, and wanting to die. And I'm watching people laugh because I'm the punchline. And so that gave me a special sense of empathy and compassion for people like Tiger Woods and some of the other celebrities when these things happen. And the jokes may be funny, and they are funny, but they're not so funny to me because I've been the punchline. And so I have a certain sense of empathy and compassion. And I just ask, please don't send me those jokes. I'm no goody two shoes. I'm no Pollyanna. It's just that I know what happens to my wife, my kids, my friends, my family, and the suffering they go through as a result of all of this stuff. So I don't participate in it. I'm talking to a different audience tonight. I normally, when I'm talking to groups of people, it's a recovery audience, and it's a particular kind of recovery audience. And so I need to choose my words carefully here tonight and try to just give you the story. And I'm going to tell you that that I was born in Wichita, Kansas in September of 1938. So I'm on the south side of age 82, which doesn't seem to bother me. I just look at it as another number. And I'm still very, very active. But I grew up in a World War II housing project on the southeast side of Wichita. It was a temporary housing project that was put there during World War II. It's called Plainview. And that place is still there, and it was not designed to be. But it was an economically deprived area when I lived there. And yet there's a strange thing about that. I mean, it wasn't a very pretty place, and none of us had much, and we were all struggling to get by. But the happiest memories of my entire childhood involved growing up in Plainview, Wichita, there about in the 50s. It's a diverse community. It was blacks and whites, Hispanics, a small Native American segment. I was part of the Native American segment. Ethnically, I'm a mix of several different things, but the parts that really, really enjoy the alcohol are the Irish and Comanche parts. In spite of the circumstances that I grew up in, I was a happy kid. I was happy living there in Plainview. And we got along amazingly well. I don't remember seeing a police car on a call maybe more than once or twice all the entire time I was there. We didn't have any drive-by shootings. We didn't have any gangs. Drugs were very, very scant. Alcohol was plentiful, but drugs were very, very scant. And it, because I guess we were all the same, I didn't know the difference. And I've got many, many happy memories of growing up that way until I was 14. Both of my parents are alcoholics. Both of my parents died from this disease. And I was 14 when the alcohol finally did what it always does. We talk about alcoholism. One of the characteristics of this disease is it's chronic and it's progressive. And diabetes is a very close medical model to it. There's a heavy genetic predisposition in about 70 to 80% of the cases, not always. And once it's in place, it cannot be cured. It can be arrested, but it cannot be cured. And it's progressive. And that means with time, it only gets worse. There will be plateaus in which it levels off a little bit, and you will get the idea that maybe it's getting better, and then it plummets again. Over time, it will always get worse. And I was 14 by the time it actually had gotten to the point where it was destroying both of my parents. A lot of bad things happened to my family. They got a divorce, which I didn't see coming, and it affected me very heavily, and as it did my sister, who was 2 years younger than I was. Within the next 3 years, each of those parents have been married and divorced 2 more times. And I didn't get along very well in blended families. I had clashes and conflicts. Strangely, I don't remember any of my stepsisters or stepbrothers or any of those folks. And they could come in and sit down next to me in a room, and I would not know who they were. I graduated from high school when I was 17. And not too many people from my particular area went to college. Some did, but not a whole lot. And I didn't have the funds to go to college, and I had decided I was going to join the service. And about that time, one of my friends came back from the Marine Corps. And I was pretty impressed. He was right out of boot camp. So I sat in a bar with him one afternoon. I had just turned 18. I sat at a bar with him one afternoon, and I just was spellbound by the stories that he was telling me about Marine drill instructors and his experiences in Marine Corps boot camp. And these stories were pretty graphic. They were pretty sadistic. They were pretty brutal. And they were very extreme. And I remember sitting there, and I was just captured by those. And I thought, well, I can't wait to go try that. And I know that there was a part of me that questioned whether or not I could handle something like that, whether or not I could even survive it. And within a few days, I had signed on the line, and off I went into Marine Corps boot camp. I hear many alcoholics and addicts talk about things, and there are 2 common themes that seem to kind of surface quite often. One of them is I never fit in. I never felt like I belonged. And that is not true in my story. Once I got into Marine Corps boot camp, once I got over the initial shock of it and I settled into it, I knew I belonged. I knew it was where I wanted to be. And my friend was right. It was brutally extreme and demanding. And I mean, absolutely no disrespect to the other services, but Marine Corps boot camp is a standalone, one of a kind situation and experience. And once I got in there, and once I experienced the thing that the Marine Corps is known for, that's camaraderie. That's the esprit de corps. That's a sense of belonging and brotherhood. That's this inextricable binding of one Marine to another, and the importance of that and what that means. And that absolutely captured me. And I thought to myself, this is where I belong. This is where I'm going to stay. And as boot camp came to an end, after 13 weeks, the drill instructors called out 3 names. Of the 3 top guys in the platoon, my name was the second one called. I was amazed. I was astounded. I simply wanted to survive the experience. I had no idea that I was doing that well. So I got a promotion, a meritorious promotion to private first class, one stripe on my sleeve. And that's not a whole lot of rank. You do not run the Marine Corps as a private first class, but that rank was meaningful. And I could not take my eyes off my shoulder, that red bordered stripe that I had, and all of my buddies were still slick sleeve privates. And we went to Camp Pendleton for combat training. And because I was a PFC, I was in a Quonset hut where it was nice and warm, and my buddies were outside on a cold, rainy night with rifles on their shoulders, walking guard duty. And I remember looking over and seeing a first lieutenant's uniform over there. Saw that silver bar, and I remember thinking, I'm staying here. This is where I belong. At the rate I'm going, general's just not that far away. So I stayed in the Marine Corps, and I always excelled. One of the things that happens on these stories is that typically there's a drunkalog to be told, and I've got one. But I can either concentrate on the drunkalog or I can concentrate on the recovery aspect of this story, but I can't do both. I can tell you that I was drinking. I've always drank hard. I do not remember drinking ever without getting drunk. And I know that that's not an accurate memory, or I'd be dead. But I do not remember ever just having a few drinks. I always chased the drinks. I chased the feeling. And I always ended up drunk. I always went shooting past it. I could never target that place and stay there. I always went past it, which is pretty typical of most alcoholics. Again, it's chronic and progressive. And so my drinking didn't stand out particularly for a long, long time. However, I was always in a hard drinking environment. First of all, I was a young Marine. I'm supposed to be tough. I'm supposed to be hard. I'm supposed to be able to drink. Then later I was a fighter pilot. Same thing there. Later on, I was an airline pilot. Same thing there. I remember the specific evening when it occurred to me that my drinking was escalating beyond that of my friends and comrades, although I didn't see it that way. As a matter of fact, I remember drinking with a group of them one night, and I got up and left finally. Each of them had two more drinks in front of them that they had not drank because I'd ordered them. And mine were all gone. And I remember walking out of there, and I thought, man, they're getting old. They just can't drink anymore. I was actually embarrassed for them. I actually was embarrassed for them. I thought, man, I hope that never happens to me. Of course, it wasn't, because I'm the alcoholic in the bunch, and my tolerance is continuing to increase. And it takes more and more and more for me to get to that feel good place. But I didn't know that. I didn't know that at the time. I always excelled. I hear the stories so much around some of the conferences and conventions that we have, and the stories are incredibly diverse. And if I want to sit there and pick out differences, I'm over 31 years sober right now, and I can still sit in a group or listen to speakers and pick out differences and say, I didn't do that. I never drank like that. I didn't do those particular things. I can set myself apart just based on the differences. But I listen for the similarities. And the similarities are simply this: that regardless of who the person is or the speaker is, regardless of how exciting or his story may be or may not be, I don't listen for specific facts and circumstances. What I listen for is what happened. What happened to that person, both internally and externally? There's always loss involved. And the greatest loss occurs internally. The loss occurs within me. And of course, there are material losses that take place as well. And I always hear those, I always see those, I always feel those when that speaker is talking. I can feel the shame and the disgrace and the dishonor and all of the loss and the pain. And then later when we get into recovery, I see the uphill swing and I see what recovery does. And I identify with that as well. And that's what I listen for. Our drinking patterns are all over the place. One of the reasons I thought I could never be an alcoholic was I didn't drink in the mornings. And I'd seen it on TV and in the movies, alcoholics drank in the mornings. I didn't do that. I didn't beat or abuse my wife or kids. I didn't get drunk every single night. I didn't, or on the weekends. My drinking pattern varied. I could go for a month without drinking. And towards the end, I didn't, and I wouldn't. But I used that as a test. I devised some tests just to see if I could possibly be alcoholic. I was watching my parents, and I passed all the tests naturally. Of course, these tests were all devised with absolutely zero factual knowledge of what the disease of alcoholism was. I limited the test based on some behavioral aspects, and I set myself apart as being different. And so if those were alcoholics and my behavior was a little bit different, then i.e. I was not one of them. And I could not have been more wrong about more things. I've been in the Marine Corps. The second promotion I got was meritorious. I was doing well. I was always at the top. I was always doing well. So many of these stories start with a person who is really young and they get into the alcoholism and addiction part so badly that they end up under a bridge or losing things, dropping out of school in the 8th grade, and they just and their dreams are murdered early on. Others, like me, the drinking continued, but it didn't get in my way too much until it did, and that was towards the tail end. And by that time, I had climbed the ladder. I had gotten a chance to live my dreams. And then, in the cruel way that alcoholism and addiction works, those dreams were shattered, blown away, and my life burned to the ground with me standing in the middle of it. But of the two groups, I consider myself the more fortunate because at least I got to experience what I wanted to experience before it was all lost. I came walking in one day and my commanding officer took me into his office and he said, "There's a new program out called Marine Aviation Cadet." He said, "You're the only guy in the unit whose entry scores, which were at that time referred to as a GCT score, you're the only one who has a score high enough to go test for that program if in fact you're interested." Well, I'd always wanted to fly airplanes, but that was a vague, whispery, ambiguous thing. I was not anywhere close to being up front on my radar scope. I knew pilots had to have college educations. I didn't have any college. I knew pilots had some prestige. They didn't come from Plainview. They didn't come out of an alcoholic home, and they didn't come out of the Native American segment. But he's telling me that based on my test score coming into the Marine Corps, I'm eligible to go test for this program. And I wanted to, and I said I did, and I went and tested. It was an all-day thing, and I passed. He then said to me, "There's some other things you need to know about this." He said, "This is an 18-month program." He said, "It's incredibly, intensely, rapidly paced." And he said, "It's demanding." And he said, "On average, plus or minus, about half don't make it." And he said, "The other thing is you're coming in the back door. You're an enlisted Marine. You've been allowed to take a test. 98 to 99% of the rest of the people in this program have to come in from the civilian side, and they have to have 2 years college minimum to even enter the program. Many of them will have their degrees. They'll be much more educated than you are, and you need to know that." And I knew that if half didn't make it roughly, I was on the high probability end of not making it based on this very large educational deficit that I was starting off with. And I said, "I want to try." I had grown up in my native culture. That was where I identified. I'd been very active in the powwows in Wichita, in the native community. I had powwowed all over Oklahoma during the summer times. I was a dancer. And when I went home, preparatory to going to Pensacola the next day, there was a powwow going on. And I went out and they called for an honoring dance for me because of my selection and my trip to Pensacola the next morning. And so I led the dance around the arena. And the next day I made my drive to Pensacola. And that dance imprinted and impacted me very, very much. All the way to Pensacola, I kept thinking, there's no way that I can come back to my native community as a failure. Of all the people there, I'm the only one who has this golden opportunity to do this thing. And if I'm successful, I'll get a set of gold wings. If I'm successful, I'll be a commissioned Marine Corps officer. That's a long way from that 18-year-old kid private that walked into Marine Corps boot camp some years earlier. And there's no way that I can fail. I cannot come back as a failure. And so I was driven with that for the entire time I was in flight training. There were 4 phases to flight training at that time, and every one of those phases, I ended up as the number 2 guy. And I never saw it coming. I never believed it. I never thought I was doing as well as my grades indicated. I was always surprised. I never got cocky or confident or complacent. I'm watching my friends wash out weekly, sometimes daily. And they want to fly as much as I do, every bit as much as I do. But for some reason, they're not going to make it. And they washed out and they've been eliminated along the way. And their hearts are broken. They came to say goodbye to me with a sea bag over their shoulder. And I don't recall any of them ever meeting my eye as they said their goodbyes. And I watched them walk away, hearts broken, dreams shattered, and they're not going to fly. And every time that happened, I thought that will be me before this is over. But I continued to work. You know, I told you my parents died from alcoholism. It's true. And a lot of bad things happened along the way. But I never give a talk like this without thanking my parents for the good things they gave me. I am indebted to my parents. They were not drunk all the time. And before the alcohol killed them, they showed me with their examples and their teachings, and they gave me some good tools. And one of them is a good work ethic. And I saw that in them before it was destroyed. And so I'm willing to work. And I did while I was in flight training. I worked hard. The last 6 months of flight training, I left the Florida area and went to Beeville, Texas for advanced jet flight training. Now, let me tell you, I'm drinking hard all the way through flight training. Friday night and Saturday nights, I'm with my cadet buddies. And I mean, we are rip roaring, going 200 miles an hour, hair on fire, just drinking and raising. Holy heck. And I mean, we are going hard. But on Sunday, I put a stop to it. And there's a text in one of the programs, in the program that I primarily belong to. And it says at some point along the way, we could control our drinking before we got past that point. And I could control my drinking at that point because there was something I wanted to do that was far more important to me than drinking. And that was, I wanted those gold wings. And so on Sunday, I'm not drinking. I'm studying, I'm prepping, I'm getting ready for the upcoming week. I went to Beeville, Texas for advanced jet flight training for my final 6 months. And I thought if I can just get past this part of it, I get those gold wings. The night I got into town, which was a Friday night in August of 61, I guess. And I got drunk with a bunch of my buddies, and we went to a drive-in, old-fashioned drive-in there, because we were cadets and we had an inside edge with the good-looking South Texas girls. And there's a lot of them. And they went after a carload of girls, and I kind of hung back, thinking I need a few more things I need to rehearse a few things. I need to drink some more. And finally I walked up to the car, and the girl looked at me, and she was really pretty, really pretty. And everything that I had rehearsed that I thought was so really good, just vacated. I'm standing there empty-headed and flat-footed, and she has this look of expectation like I'm supposed to say something. And I hadn't been talking very much and been drinking a whole lot. And it kind of slurred and came out of my eyes. I remember being impressed with the brown eyes I saw. They were beautiful brown eyes. I said something to the effect of, I just got this good brown eye. So it didn't come out very well. And she looked at me like I just peed on the side of her car. And I was embarrassed. Turned around, walked away, and thought, I'm not going back. A little while later, she got out and walked into the ladies' room. And I got a really good look at her. And she had a cute little butt on her, turquoise shorts, shapely legs. And I had a thought then, and had an accidental encounter with her the next morning, or the next day rather. And she had a girlfriend. I had a buddy with me. She let me buy her a cup of coffee and told me her name was Barbara. And Barbara and I began to date. And on February the 25th of 1963, she pinned a set of gold wings over my heart. She put 2 gold bars on my shoulders. And I got to tell you, it was a day that was beyond anything Hollywood could ever have scripted. I had finally completed this intensive, massive, wonderful program, this flight training program. I had those set of gold wings. I could go home now. I had those gold bars. I am a commissioned Marine Corps officer, something I'd only been able to dream of. And I've got this good-looking girl who thinks I'm okay. And we went home to Wichita for 3 weeks, and she stayed with my sister. And as the leave was coming to an end, I called her and I said, I've got orders to California. You're going home to Texas. And I said, let's get married. She said, okay. And we drove down to a small town in Oklahoma, just south of the Oklahoma state line, a little town called Newkirk. We stood in front of the Justice of Peace and we got married. I'm going to kind of pause, and I'll come back to this if I can remember where I was. I want to talk about the morning of my arrest. It was March the 8th of 1990. My sobriety date is March the 7th of 1990. date I had my last drink. So some people celebrate the last drink. Some people call it the first day of sobriety. I just call it March the 7th of 1990, and I've not had anything to drink since then, at least not up to this point. And we flew from Fargo, North Dakota to the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul International Airport. And I walked off the airplane that morning into the arms of airport policemen, FAA officials, and Northwest Airlines higher management people. I could leave the airline anonymous, and hopefully by the time I'm done, you'll understand why I didn't do that. But the minute I walked off the airplane and saw those people, I can tell you that I was absolutely inundated all the way to my bone marrow with a feeling of shame, disgrace, complete total dishonor, because this wasn't supposed to happen to me. This is not how I lived my life. I had not lived my life doing dishonorable things. To the contrary, I had striven to excel. I'd worked hard a lot of times against the odds to do the best I always could, to go the extra mile, to surpass the people around me and always do better. And all of a sudden, my life turns upside down and all my values are gone and reversed. I'm shattered, I'm destroyed as a result of being an alcoholic. Because I'll tell you something about this disease. At some point in time, without fail, the disease will overpower my intentions. I can't live up to the things that had always mattered and been the most important to me. The disease takes over and I succumb to it. And that's what had happened. That's what had happened. I had no idea this was going to go public at that moment in time, but I can tell you that over the 12 hours of that day, the arrest, the surreal experience where I felt like I was suspended in a room sometimes watching this happen to somebody else, because this could not be happening to me. And yet it was. And yet it was. And then I'd have those gut grinding moments of reality where it was all I could do to avoid throwing up and getting sick. We gave blood at 2 facilities. It was at the second facility where a reporter saw 5 uniformed people, 2 cops and 3 pilots, and looked into it because he thought there might be a story. And that's how it broke to the public. I had no idea that was coming. Northwest Airlines at that point in time was the only major carrier in the United States that did not have a program for alcoholic pilots. That program came into existence in 1973. It's called the HIMSS program, HIMS. And it had been spectacularly successful for all those years, but Northwest had refused to go along with it. They said they didn't have any alcoholic pilots. I knew better, but I didn't think I was one of them. But Northwest had refused to go along with the industry. And so every few years when a pilot got in difficulty and involved alcohol, I saw the outcome. We all did. And it was explosive. It was swift. It was severe. It was irrevocable. No pilot ever came back. And those stories absolutely burst among the pilots and flight attendants like wildfire. And we heard about them within a day or so. They just ripped through the airlines. And over the course of that 12 hours, I was detained. I had a million thoughts, and that was one of them. That's how I leave here. That's my legacy. I leave here in shame. And I had never done anything like that before, ever. I got back to a commuter apartment. And for the first time, I thought, oh my God, I'm supposed to be home tonight. And Barbara had waited at the Atlanta airport for 4 hours for me to show up. And I, of course, naturally didn't make it. And I called and she was still gone. And I left a message saying, there's been a disaster. I think I've lost my job. I'll be home at first flight in the morning. I don't know why she didn't call me back, but she didn't. Later, I was grateful for that because I was so sick at heart. I just didn't want to talk about this. I got home the next morning, early in the morning. I exited the Atlanta airport as quickly as possible because I knew a lot of people out there. I used to talk and laugh with the mechanics and the baggage handlers and the groomers and the agents, and I didn't want anybody to see me, stop me, speak to me or anything. So I exited as quickly as I could. And I saw Barbara parked off to the right. And I've never told this story without saying I felt like I had to climb over the curb to get in the car with her. This is now Friday, March the 9th. I'm going to hear two statements on this particular day that I cannot mentally process. And I got in the car with Barbara. We've been married a long time. I could not look at her. And she pulled away from the car. And all I could say was, honey, I'm so sorry. Honey, I'm so sorry. She's got a very soft South Texas voice. And she pulled away and she said, who better than I might possibly understand how you feel right now? We drove home in silence. Later, I thought, what wife, having learned that her husband had just trashed a 22-year golden career, would not have said to him, why did you stay and drink? You've seen this before. You knew what happened. Why didn't you go back to your hotel? Those were all good questions. Every one of them was a good question. I didn't have an answer for any of them. But gratefully, thankfully, she never said a word to me. We drove home in silence. She went to work and I went inside the house, and I did not want to be in my own skin. And a few minutes later, I decided I needed to call somebody. So I called a PhD family doctor who'll get in the story here in a little bit. And I said to him, I need to declare an emergency. So I need to see you right away. He said, I'll clear the calendar. Come on in. So I went over there. I've told this story hundreds of times, and every time I do it, it's like I see the video and the movie right in front of me. And I can still see the color of his walls, the office layout. And I walked in and I told him straight out what had happened. If there was a good thing that had happened thus far, it was that I was so totally destroyed that I had no more will to fight or resist. I was just done. So I told him straight out what had happened. And he pulled back in shock and recoil, and he looked at me and said, God, Lyle, he said, this is horrible. He said, this is just horrible. And then he started around his desk, and I heard the first statement that day of the two that were coming that I could not even respond to. And he looked at me and he said, but maybe this is what had to happen. I had no earthly idea why he would say that to me. I had no idea how that connected to anything. Why he would say that to me. And I didn't respond. He left and he came back a few minutes later and he said, I've got you set up to see a doctor tonight at 6 o'clock. He's on the other side of Atlanta. He said, I worked with him. I was on staff with him some years back. He's a very prominent psychiatrist here in Atlanta. He's also a recovering alcoholic and cocaine addict. And he's certified in addiction medicine, which I had never, ever heard of. Even in the condition that I was in, I knew that doctors don't typically see patients at 6 o'clock on Friday nights. So I knew there was a sense of urgency about this. Some years later, the doctor that had set up the appointment said to me, he said, based on your appearance, he said, I was afraid that you were a suicide. And it was imperative to get you over to see that man as quickly as possible. So Barbara and I drove over there and saw him. And I have no real memory of that meeting. I hadn't had anything to eat or drink for 2 days. But it's just like an alcoholic blackout. I've had any number of those. I know I was there. I know I saw him. I suspect he did what all doctors do. He took a family history, asked me a lot of questions. I don't remember what he asked me. I do remember that I was open, naked, and honest. That I gave him straight answers as best I could at that moment in time. And at some point, he looked at me and said, well, you're an alcoholic. And there was a meaningful moment then, because I have always hated alcoholics. And I had no reaction to being told that I was an alcoholic in a way that I'll go to my grave, never understanding in the 24 hours since the arrest, somehow, some way down deep inside, I knew those dots got connected. I knew that I had become that one thing I had sworn I would never be, an alcoholic. And I looked at him, I said, I thought you would probably tell me that, and I'm okay with it. But I said, please let me go home. Let Barbara, I need Barbara to just hang on to me. I said, let my mind uncoil. Let me absorb what's happened to me. And then I'll go into treatment. And he said, "You need to go into treatment tonight." And I took a breath and I paused. I looked at him. I said, "Okay." So I drove into the treatment center with the clothes on my back and nothing more. As we approached the treatment center, it was dark, of course, and there was a sign on the corner. The headlights swept it, and I hit the brakes, and the sign was directly in front of me. And it said, "Anchor Hospital, a hospital for alcoholism and other chemical dependencies." And I sat and I looked at the sign, and there's a reality to that. The words are in front of me, the sign is in front of me. And I thought to myself, my God Almighty, my life ends tonight in a treatment center for alcoholics. What happened? What happened? And I had a little brief mini flashback over the course of my life. And there were many, many high points and high accomplishments and achievements, most of them against the odds. And these were my trophy moments. And I sat there and it was as if they had never occurred. And I wasn't even sure they had. And I had no self-worth at that moment. I had no value as a human being, none. And we started down the treatment. We started down the road and the hill into the treatment center. And as we were making our way to the treatment center, which was a couple of 100 yards ahead of us, it occurred to me for the first time that day, this is March the 9th. This is my 27th wedding anniversary. And I said to Barbara, very defeatedly, "Hell of a way to spend an anniversary, huh?" I then heard the second statement that I could not respond to. Very softly, she said, "Might be the best one we ever had." And I thought to myself, how could anybody think that? My life is over. It's absolutely over. I had not even an ounce of hope. No pilot had ever come back from something like this. And all the other pilots whose situations I had watched weren't even 10% as bad as mine was. So I knew it was done. It was over. There could be no coming back from this. And yet she uttered those words. I was glad she was not hysterically crying, but I thought to myself, I don't know how she could manufacture thought like that. My life is completely gone. It will never reoccur. It can't. I'd like to just kind of break this up a little bit and say that a few years back, March the 9th rolled around, about 9 in the morning, clear blue skies, gorgeous day, beautiful temperature, and up the driveway comes a sponsee of mine in this program that I belong to. It surprised me, and I said to him, I said, "What are you doing here?" And he said, "I've heard the story. It's March the 9th. He said, "I thought I'd come by and surprise you and Barbara, wish you happy anniversary." So we went inside, and the coffee's on, and we're talking. He says, during the conversation, he says, "Well, what's the secret for having stayed married so long?" And before I get a chance to say anything, Barbara pipes up and she said, "I think it's mostly due to the fact that I could just never stand to admit I made a mistake." So we do a lot of laughing around my house, usually at my expense, but I like it. I like it. And as long as she retains that feeling that she just can't stand to admit she made a mistake, we'll continue on this journey. March 9th just passed, was our 58th wedding anniversary. I went into treatment, place I never thought I'd be. Never thought I'd be in a treatment center. And it was a week before anybody knew the color of my eyes because my head was always down on my shoe tops. I didn't want to talk, didn't want to do anything. I'm so ashamed. But the television took care of all of that because on about day 2 or 3, it's blaring the news. And now everybody in that treatment center knows who I am. The humiliation is even more expanded than it was. The good thing was when I went in there was that I was broken. I was destroyed. So I listened to what they said and I hoped it was truthful. They talk about a big book. They talk about a 12 and 12. We talk about steps, 12 steps. I hoped that there was some meat to that. I hope that those things actually really worked once I left treatment. I hope they really worked if I left a particular recovery meeting. And the only reason I sit here and tell this story is to let those of you who are out there wondering and thinking the very same thing, I want to let you know that that's true. It's all true. It is all true. However, there's a two-part contract in all of this, and I've got to do my part before that program is going to work. And I've done my part. A week to the day that I went into treatment, it was announced on TV that Northwest Airlines had terminated me, as they should have. The FAA had issued an emergency revocation of all my flight certificates. That was fair and appropriate. And I had lost my FAA medical certificate because of my diagnosis of alcoholism. So I'm stripped bare. I have no aviation credentials. I have no education to fall back on. During flight training, I was the only guy in there that I knew who had no college. And yet I had managed to do well. There are others that I've met since then that have no college, but we're few and far between, and I didn't know anybody at that time. So I got no education. I have no background to prop me up. I'm done. The only thing I know how to do is fly an airplane, and that's all gone. It's all gone. I think the tragedy, the real tragedy of alcoholism and addiction is not what happens to the person who has it. We deserve it. I believe when you do what you did, you get what you got. I'm responsible and I'm accountable, whether I'm drinking or not. But the tragedy is that I bring it to my wife and my children, my friends, my family. All of the suffering flows to them, and they do not deserve it. It's just not fair to them. But as an alcoholic or an addict, that's what I do. I went into a group room about that same time. One of the things that I have left out, and I need to go back and get this part in, is that I got out of the Marine Corps after 11 and a half years. I'd even managed to get a regular commission, which guaranteed me a Marine Corps career. And I loved it. I was going to stay until I either couldn't fly or died. But by the way things were going, I went to Vietnam. We were one of the first groups into Vietnam. I came out of there. We were flying out of a very primitive airfield called Chu Lai, 50 miles south of Da Nang. I came home with some decorations. I had acquitted myself well. I always did well. But I knew that if I stayed in, I was going to be gone for 4 to 6 years from my wife and my 2 small children. We went to, so I resigned finally. It was a painful decision, but I got out. 3 weeks later, I was in class at Northwest Airlines. Barbara had decided she wanted a daughter, and we decided to adopt. And we worked really hard because we had 2 biological boys, and so it was a real fight for us. And we fought hard for 14 months. And we bring home this little girl. She was 17 days old. Most beautiful little girl I've ever seen, and she was now our daughter. She couldn't walk past me without me scooping her up, looking at that beautiful little face and saying, "Thanks for being my girl." And she would look and say, "Thanks for being my dad." I found out what little girls do to their dads. I had my 2 rough and tumble boys, and I loved them to death. But that little girl just became the center of my universe. I thought we had the perfect everything, perfect career, perfect home finally, perfect everything. And she ran away when she was 17 years old. And I didn't see it coming. My drinking is continuing on during this period of time. But again, I'm not beating or abusing my kids. I'm not doing this. I'm not doing that. I can set myself apart. I can come up with 100 ideas why I could not be an alcoholic, except for the fact that I was. I was. Once I learned about the disease, I see myself as an alcoholic easily. No problem. But I didn't know that at the time. I'd put off being captain for about 2 years because I wanted to be home with my little girl. And finally, I go to Chicago to take a special written test. And the afternoon that I left, Dawn ran away. And I came home the next day to find out that my little girl had run away. I actually found out that morning from Chicago when I called home. And I was panicked to death. I blurted, "My little girl's gone. My beautiful little girl's gone. I don't know what's happening to her." So I told Barbara where to go and who to call and where to look. something happened to me on that 2-hour flight home, and I have no idea what it was. I'm not aware of it. But when I got off the airplane, I hated her. I was no longer fearful. I hated her. And I didn't know I could hate that hard. I told Barbara, I said, I don't care if she dies in the streets. She'll never come back to my house. Not to my home. And within 2 days, every piece of furniture she'd ever had in here had gone to Goodwill. There was no physical trace she'd ever been in my home. I went to the bank and I ripped up her adoption papers. I went to an attorney and disowned her. And I tried to annul the adoption and I couldn't. And in this tornadic whirl of activity, it appeared to me that Barbara wasn't handling all this too well. And she probably needs some help and a therapist. And I got in the phone book, and by the luck of the draw, got a PhD family therapist. We saw him twice a month for almost 2 years. Here's an interesting part. My alcohol quit working for me. My drinking really picked up at this point. I'm not an alcoholic because Don ran away from home, not at all. But my drinking accelerated for sure, and it never worked for me again. I can still remember the feeling from drinking. 31 years later, I have a clear, vivid recall of the warmth, the glow, that internal lessening of everything, that sense of peace and ease and comfort that I get when I drink, because I make some strong, and by the time the second hand gets all the way around, I can feel it. I never recapture that ever again, ever. Now I didn't want to go out with the crews on layovers. I didn't want to go out and eat and laugh and have fun. I just went to my room. I know where every liquor store was in every town we flew into in the United States, and how long it took me to get up there, get a bottle of booze, and get down to my room. I'd lock the door, turn the phone on or turn the TV on. I wouldn't answer the phone if a crew member called. I wouldn't go to the door if they knocked. I sat and I drank. And I wanted the relief that I always got, and it never happened again. Because the minute I slugged the alcohol down, it was like I had a fire in my belly and I'm throwing gas on top of it. And up came the hatred and the bitterness and the self-pity and the martyrdom and this long list of all these things I'd done for this little girl, and look how I'd gotten repaid. And now by the time I get to the end of the bottle, I'm emotionally exhausted. I'm tired. I'm worn out. And the very next night in a different town, I'll do it again and again and again and again. I kept doing that and I kept getting the same result. Never got relief again, ever. And that's pretty much where it was with when the rest came and I went into treatment. The doctor tried to get me to talk one time about my daughter, and I made a statement that flew out of my mouth that I never uh, manufactured before. I never even had the thought that I was aware of. But as he tried to get me to talk, I looked at him and said, I'm going to tell you something, doctor. I said, I would rather hate than hurt. And that was a one-sentence portrayal of exactly who I was and how I dealt with things. He said, you survived a childhood doing that, and if you continue, it'll destroy you. And he was right. That week after I went into treatment, I walked into a day room, 8 or 10 people. They closed the door. And for some reason that is so counterintuitive, I began to talk about my girl, my daughter, and I didn't have that wall of hatred and that wall of anger that had always blocked the feeling of pain. It worked every time, but I didn't have it anymore. And I broke down and cried. I hadn't cried. I didn't cry. I didn't even cry at my parents' funerals. But I sat in there with a broken heart and I sobbed about the loss of my little girl. And I felt naked, ashamed, and embarrassed. It was one of the greatest breakthroughs that I ever had in treatment, because now I'm starting to recapture those feelings of humanness that every human being is entitled to. And I'd shut mine down for a long time. And here it came. I got hold of Barbara and I said, let's put the family back together again. This treatment center had no visitors and no phone calls. And they heard about this and they said, that is such an amazing breakthrough. If you can make that happen, we'll give you a day room. A few days later, some days later, I walked into a day room and my daughter was there. My 2 sons were there. The 2 doctors had heard about this and said, could we please come watch this? Because they'd written this off as impossible. They were off to my left as I walked into the room. My little girl was smaller than I remembered. I hadn't seen her in 2 years. I walked over and put my arms around her and told her how much I loved her instead of how much I hated her. She had a 5-month-old granddaughter in her arms that I didn't know anything about. And she got married and I didn't even know her last name. good things are starting to happen to me in treatment in spite of all of the other stuff. And I told my kids, you need to get ready to see your father handcuffed on television and led away into prison. So prepare for that. I went through 6 legal crises in that treatment center. You know, they don't want to come tell you your wife called and said the washing machine broke down, or one of your kid just dented a fender. They want to isolate you and not let you focus. But they were having to come tell me this. I went through 6 legal crises in there, starting with 90 days in jail misdemeanor and escalating all the way up. And every time they take me out of a group, it was just like they sucked the air out of the room and I couldn't breathe. My heart felt like it was stopping. I'd never been locked up before. The only time I thought I'd ever be locked up was as a POW in Vietnam, if I was shot down. And these sentences are doubling and everything is getting worse. And finally, the 6th time, there's a doctor and he takes me out and he says, they take me down to his office and my counselor's down there. Made me sit down. He said, Lyle, he said, North Dakota, Minnesota's indicted you several times now. Penalties have doubled. But now a federal grand jury has just come in and you're looking at 15 years in federal prison, a $250,000 fine, and an attorney's coming and sending wants $50,000, which I didn't have. We went broke within 30 days after the arrest. I had grown up with nothing. Now I have taken my wife there. And the doctor says, I have to ask you if you're going to hurt yourself. And I said, no. And I went back to my room and I collapsed. I don't remember falling, but I remember my head being on the carpet and I was crying for the 2nd time in treatment. And I said, God, I can't do this anymore. Not even one more time. I don't have anything left. Please help me. I cannot do it even one more time, please. And I slept that night. I had many life-changing breakthrough experiences in treatment because I went in there hoping and betting on this program that I'm a part of, because it was clear to me that my answers no longer worked. There had to be something better, and this was it. And I'm here to tell you that. I got out of treatment. I was immediately in a very heavily publicized 3-week trial. In the time that I'm here and I'm watching a timer down here, you're going to hear about 30% of this whole story. I just don't have time for the rest of it. One of them is a story about an attorney that I had. It's an amazing story, but I don't have time. I told him, I said, I'll be found guilty. As a matter of fact, I wanted to plead guilty, and he talked me out of it for reasons that made sense. They told me in treatment, you're going to have to learn to listen, and you're going to have to learn to trust. And so I did. We drew the toughest judge in the Minnesota Federal District up there. I never got a break anywhere along the way. There were precious few times when I had any say about anything, but occasionally there was a possibility that something could go one way or the other, and it never, ever, not even one time, went the way I was hoping. This judge had strong feelings about this case, and I saw him. And he was entitled to them because I had been involved in a horrific betrayal of the public trust, and I knew it. And I never made an excuse for it. The jury goes out, and the jury comes back, and I know what that means. I'm the captain. Everything comes to me first. Guilty. I saw my lawyer flinch, and I reached over and just patted and tapped him on the leg. I said, it's okay. It's okay. We went back a month later for the sentencing. My situation went through the courts very, very quickly. You hear about these things come up, and it takes a year, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years before the criminal system does its thing. I was arrested in March. I was in a federal courtroom in July and August. I was sentenced in October, and I was in prison in December. My thing went very, very quickly, driven by a lot of public pressure, publicity. We went back for the sentencing. I had an advantage over the other 2 guys. Why? Because I'm an alcoholic. Because I have a program, and there are 12 steps involved in it, and I know how to use those steps, and they're immensely powerful. I didn't have much sobriety, but I had enough, and I had worked really hard in treatment. They didn't have the tools that I had. And so at night, I could go to a recovery meeting, and I walk in and I'm all over TV and everybody knows who I am. And so it's scary, and I have to pause for a minute, and I just sat and I never shared. I just took the energy that was in that room, and I went to the courtroom the next morning, and I sat through an indescribable criminal trial experience, being portrayed as the most worthless human being on the planet. And sometimes I would look across at Barbara and our eyes would meet, and she would mouth the words, I love you. And I would nod and I'd be okay. I'd be okay. So I stand up for the sentencing. My attorney had called me. He said, I have to tell you, we got bad news. The judges, their guidelines are in place, 10 months to 18, or 12 to 18 months. I'd been in treatment with a federal judge. He said the sentencing is a charade. He said, when we come through the door, sentence is set regardless of what you, your attorney, or witnesses talk about. I'd spoken all over the United States and Canada, and the judges had come up to me and said, that's correct. They've corroborated that. My attorney said he can go all the way to 15 years now. And I felt that heart-stopping, bone marrow penetrating terror that was so familiar. And I told Barbara, I said, this is about step one. I'm powerless over this. I have no control. This is about the serenity prayer. I accept the things I cannot change. I cannot change what's going to happen. I must accept it. And I went in the courtroom the next morning with that attitude. The judge lectured about what was getting ready to happen. And I'm the captain. I stand up first. And all I could think of was, I'm grateful for my sobriety. I'm grateful for what happened in my family. I didn't know what I was going to say as I stood up because I was so scared. I said, I can't change anything. I accept the responsibility I have from day one. The judge put a sentence on me of 16 months, 2 months less under the guidelines. They blew everyone in the courtroom away. I knew a miracle had happened. I didn't think I'd ever know why exactly. A couple of years later, he told my attorney in chambers, he said, I was going to sentence Lyle to 4 years in prison. I changed from the bench. The thing that judges have told me never occurs, he did that morning. He said, I thought about him as a human being. I heard what he said. And I came down to 16 months. Then he did something nobody ever expected. I'd given my personal effects to Barbara. I said, I don't think I'll be coming back. He said, this is a complex case. This law was not written or designed for airline pilots. And there will be appeals, and I'll let you 3 men remain free until your appeals are exhausted. The other 2 went for it, and I said, no, I'll go in now. The judge later told my attorney, he said, I was shocked. He said, no defendant before or since has ever done that with an appeal pending. I knew I could stay out for a year, year and a half. But I remembered something way back from college or from high school days. Somebody told me it was Shakespeare. It said, a coward dies 1,000 deaths, a brave man only one. And I knew that every night when the sun went down, I was one day closer to the inevitable. I'm not going to die 1,000 deaths. And I told him, I've been convicted. I'll go in now. And so I went in on December the 5th of 1990, 34 years to the day that I entered Marine Corps boot camp as inmate 04478-041. I was terrified. I've never been in a penitentiary. And I told my kids, I said, the fact is, I can't come out the back door till I go in the front. I also remembered something else from my Marine Corps days. That courage is not the absence of fear. It's the ability to move forward in the face of it. And that's now my job. And so I went into prison. I don't tell prison stories. I had a lot of experiences in there. Audiences love prison stories. They have nothing to do with my recovery, but my recovery has everything to do with how I dealt with the people, places, and things and experiences in that prison. And I had some, because I went in there with 12 steps that are powerful and potent, and I know how to use them. I know in the order in which they're supposed to be applied, and I did it. And I acquitted myself fine in prison. Inmates would come up to me and say, how can you do what you do in here? And we'd have a talk about it, none of which they could understand. The judge put sanctions on me that made it impossible I'd ever fly again. On top of everything that already happened, he put sanctions on me that were just a coat of cement right over my coffin. A year after I got out of prison, he lifted those sanctions in a story that I don't have time for. But there wasn't one chance in 10,000 that he would do that. And he did. Then the FAA said, if you want to fly again, you start all over again from the ground up with a private license. Not one of my pilot buddies thought that was doable. I'd come out of the Marine Corps. I had a commercial instrument rating right away. Now I've got to go back literally from the ground up. But I stay sober one day at a time. I said, Barbara, I'll do the license one license at a time. 10.5 months later, I passed the writtens on all 4 licenses. And that is no easy chore. That is not easy. It's a long, hard, arduous trek. And I made it one day at a time, 1 foot at a time, 1 step at a time. but there's a flying part that goes with that, and I couldn't do it. I'm back now working at the treatment center. I'm making $14,000 a year, and I'm grateful to have that. I'm grateful for the job. I don't know how we stayed alive on $14,000 a year for almost 2 years, but we did. And I did it with an attitude of gratitude to be sober and to have that job. Pilot contacted me. He said, I've got a flight school you didn't know I had. I want you to come up and live with me and my family and go through my flight school free and get your tickets back. So I went to Minnesota under 13 conditions of probation. I've got to check in with the Minnesota Department of Corrections. And I lived with that man for 44 days, rained out 14 days. I never slowed down, never quit studying. I flew 78 hours in 30 days, and that is a lot of flying in a little airplane. Here's a bad thing about a first-person story. I, me, I, me, I, me. It's not about I or me. Not about I or me at all. I get no credit for this story. I just did what I was asked to do. That's it, period. And it all came through the recovery process. I got 4 licenses back. 2 of them by 11:15 one morning. I don't think that's ever been done before. I get home, and a month later, the licenses actually arrived physically, came in the mail. And within an hour, I got a phone call from the head of the pilot union at Northwest. The grievance had been filed because of my termination. I had not activated the grievance because Northwest Airlines was justified in terminating me. It was a fair deal, and I knew it. This pilot says to me, he said, this is the best phone call I've ever made, because he said 3 hours ago, John Dasper, president and CEO of Northwest Airlines, made a personal decision to bring you back and put you in full flight status. I sat there with tears flooding my cheeks, unable to believe the words that had just come through that telephone. If a pilot's airline is mentioned one time publicly, ever, he's done. My airline had been dragged through the mud egregiously, dozens of times, mostly a lot of it by Jay Leno. Jay Leno, in another story I don't have time for, called me in June of '96 and apologized to me. And this man's going to bring me back and let me fly again, anticipating massive negative public reaction. My name was in the headlines: felon, federal felon, alcoholic. And he dares bring me back and let me fly passengers, and he did. I went back, signed a very emotional back to work agreement with a lot of my friends there, a big crowd. Never to be a captain again. I was okay with that. I'm going to get to fly again. I'm now going to get a little bit of a retirement. I won't leave Barbara with nothing. And that had been a knife in my heart. So I went back, and I stayed for not quite 5 years. I got to know the president of the airline unlike any other pilot on the face of the property. He'd call me in once a year and we'd talk. I had great talks with him. I had no secrets. I had no fear. I had nothing to hide because I'm sober. I'm sober. I'm coming up on my last year at Northwest. Speaking of United Airlines, late at night, I get a phone call. Pilot tells me, John Dasberg has just changed your back to work agreement. He knows you're starting your final year at Northwest, and he thinks that you should be a 747 captain. I never thought anything could surpass my return to the airline. I had so horribly shamed, embarrassed, and disgraced. Nothing could ever surpass that. Now I'm going to be a captain again. I laid there for a long time, and I felt like God was looking down and grinning at me and winking and saying, every time you think I've used my miracles up, I've got one more I can show you. So I went back and I checked out the left seat of a 747. I spent the last year there, giving back. The first thing we lose is alcoholics and addicts, and one of the most golden things we ever have, and that's called trust. He trusted me because he knew I was a sober member of this recovery program that I belonged to, and he said so. I retired September 29th of 1998 when I was 60. I've got a picture off to my left over here. It's a huge picture. The picture of a 747 in the center of it. There must be 2,000 or 3,000 signatures of my peers wishing me well. Better reputation I'd ever had before in my life. I want to close. Well, let me finish something. A day or two after I had retired, my attorney called me. He said, Judge James Rosenbaum is now Chief Judge of the Minnesota Federal District. He said, he just called me. And he said, in 16 years, he has never supported a petition for pardon. But he said, if you want to make the attempt, he'll support yours. 8 years after the trial, this is. I had never considered such a thing. The judge wrote an emotional 3-page affidavit that I can't read without getting into tears by the time I'm in page 3. This affidavit is written by the man who tried me and sent me to prison. 2 years later, after all the paperwork had gone in, I got a presidential pardon from Bill Clinton. Getting the pardon from the governor of the state is almost impossible. Getting a pardon from the president of the United States is 10 times more so. I'm telling you, you've only heard about 30% of the miracles that I've been blessed to experience and enjoy. I want to close with something because I'm over time now. And it simply says this: I do not wish you joys without a sorrow, nor endless day without the healing dark, no brilliant sun without the restful shadow, nor tides that never turn against your bark. I wish you faith and strength and love and wisdom and goods, gold enough to help some needy one. I wish you songs, but also blessed silence and God's sweet peace when every day is done. My Comanche name is Yetzatanub. You know me as Lyle, and I'm an alcoholic, just like the ones I'm talking to in the attics. And I thank you for the opportunity to talk with you. And I thank you for my sobriety. That's all I've got.